Welcome to another episode of Catalyzing Radical Systemic Change, where, in my own words, it's all about discovering, mapping, and cross pollinating the various building blocks towards a planetary civilization ahead. What do I mean with a planetary civilization? Well, I genuinely mean that we, as humans, as the dominant species on this planet, are called in a transition period to become aware that ultimately we're the stewards or the shepherds of life on this planet. And I'm super grateful to be in this virtual room together in between, I think, Austin and Guatemala with Bill Kentrup. We met, I don't remember exactly when, but we always had a rapport, we had a resonance in the relationship. And what interests me in the conversation today is that Bill has worked both high level as well as boots on the ground for more than 20 years in the carbon markets. Whereas I think removing carbon from the atmosphere is only one of the big pieces of the puzzle we need to solve as humanity. Certainly today, we will focus on this important piece because in the last couple of hundred years, we've been just burning copious amounts of fossil fuels to, kick off the first, the second, the third, and now the fourth industrial revolution. So, like always in my podcast, we're not directly diving into the topic, but I'm really curious, Bill, like the pivotal moments in your biography that link back to the topic of this podcast. Like if you sketch two or three of them, doesn't really matter if they're early in your childhood, in your adolescence, during your study years, or whilst you already have been working. So yeah, just curious. We don't do this like Bill tells us like the whole story. It's really more like these intense moments when things break, and you need to reinvent yourself, or you have a pivotal moment, you feel called for a deeper alignment with your purpose. So yeah, Bill, the floor is yours. Curious to listen into some of the pivotal moments in your biography.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Alistair. Yeah, and indeed, Austin to Guatemala. The modern technology is going to help us get the message out. But yeah, so I've always been interested in environmental progress and sort of living in a better environment and doing what I can locally as I was a kid, volunteering in various capacities. But I guess sort of where it became a bit more professionalized is as an oceanographer, and that I was before I moved to Hong Kong in 2001. I was sort of more on the environmental science side of things, and I think the sort of lens that I was looking at, how can I problem solve in the environmental space was, can I be an environmental consultant, maybe an environmental lawyer? And it was kind of looking at the environmental improvement space, through that lens. And when I moved to Hong Kong, I had this, and maybe one break in terms of opening up that lens was I met some folks that were part of a large company that was a large commodities group. And as we got to sort of explore what I was doing and what they were doing, that light bulb clicked, or went on in terms of, okay, the building assets, the environmental finance side of things. How do we build just cleaner stuff? How do we build more efficient stuff? How do we create better product? It was like, wow, that impact could be much more significant than working at an environmental consulting company and writing reports and doing really fun analysis and guiding customers. But if I could sort of point this large balance sheet 3 degrees in the right direction, the impact was much larger. So that kind of gave me a sense of there's a bigger scale, or I could approach my mission with sort of more ambition and greater scale. And that was that was around 2001. And I guess the next kind of click and where it really shifted into a bit of a focus on climate. So in the oceanography side, some of the research I was doing related to climate, looking at how trace nutrients impact growth in the oceans and how that relates to CO2 balance in the ocean and atmosphere. So there was a climate angle, but with Kyoto Protocol being signed and ready to be implemented in 2005, I guess it was around 2002 or three, I started analyzing that and seeing that, okay, there's this new structure coming and it's creating this real global collaboration. Inherently, greenhouse gas, carbon finance has to be cross border. It has to be, countries with more capital helping to finance, countries that are at an early starting point start on the right foot, and it has to be tech transfer, and that has to be cross border, and the market's structured that way. And so that really was like, wow, if this turns on, this could be just incredible in terms of, a set of solutions for, for climate change, but it also will be just incredibly intriguing. I'm sitting here, I was based in Hong Kong at the time. I was there for about 22 years. And I was looking around me, like, again, we've got China over here, and then Southeast Asia and Japan, and then India over here, and just all these different intriguing markets. Some are more agrarian, some are more industrial. But the way this Kyoto framework was set up, it's like, wow, it's almost like a playground of things we could potentially do. And as a scientist, and just thinking about, wow, I could get involved in backyard biogas projects, but I can get involved in large industrial energy efficiency projects with steel companies, and I could go to coal mines and try to capture gas, and all these sort of things was, just again, like a playground of I suppose, opportunity for me to, just roll up my sleeves and go into these countries and get
Then,
them.
then let's stay with that pivotal moment in your biography. A couple of questions there to build the coherence or the resonance in the room before we dive deeper into the nitty gritty, right? Because it's a very complex field. Is what I find fascinating is, for whatever reason, it seems we're both drawn to the macro picture, right? I mean, I studied macroeconomics. We now develop big industry scale projects, and also have touch points there professionally. So I think the two questions I want to ask you is, first of all, why Hong Kong? And the second thing is, which could be a segue maybe then into another pivotal moment in your biography. How do you hold the tension that I know in my heart I hold when I go very macro, very big picture, very 30,000 foot above sea level, but I lack seeing the tangible like examples on the ground, almost like, I come from a gardener's family. And in a garden, when you curate the ecosystem, you see it. The fruits are flowering, the trees are flowering, the veggies are yummy, the berries are yummy. So why Hong Kong? And how do you hold that tension in between macro and delivering boots on the ground results?
Yeah, great question. Well, the Hong Kong side, in a way, from a environmental journey, environmental finance perspective, that was more by accident. It was my fiance at the time. We were in New York. I was finishing my master's degree, and we just had the intention to leave New York. Let's go, let's go somewhere else. And we were just thinking, where else in the U.S.? That was just kind of the level of I guess thinking we had at that time. And just coincidentally, at that moment, a company based in Hong Kong put a very sort of aggressive recruit on her. They really wanted her to, to join them in Hong Kong. And for both of us, like unfortunately, like many Americans, we just had this very limited sense of what Hong Kong was. Okay, it's this finance city in Asia, and we were trying to leave a finance city. We were trying to get out of New York. Could we be in a more I guess, natural landscape or something like that? So it was a no, no interest, but they were persistent and said, look, trust us, it's probably not what you imagine. And worst case scenario, free trip on us, come out to Hong Kong for 2 weeks and check it out. And so she went, and then she came back with all of these pictures of this subtropical, beautiful landscape, beaches, mountains. And as it turns out, Hong Kong, the city, as I think of it at least, is just 5-10% of the land area. The rest is parks, mountains. My son right now is with his friends on Lantau Peak, the largest peak in Hong Kong, freezing their butts off in a tent. He was sending me videos this morning of this weather system rolling in, and it's quite a long hike. So they're up there right now, probably laughing their butts off on a mountain
So you
overlooking.
fell in love with Hong Kong, basically. Tell me more about Hong Kong. I know nobody who has lived in Hong Kong for. I mean, you just shared you spent 22 years. So basically, you fell in love there. You moved there.
Fell in love, and I'll tell you, there's multiple, at least three things I suppose that were easy to fall in love with. One was locally. We lived in a small fishing village with two beautiful beaches, barefoot around the village, multi generational Chinese fishing village, but still 25 minutes from the city. So that, just the diversity of landscape there. By going 10 kilometers this way or that way, it's islands, coastline, mountains, and city, and then China, the border of mainland China, just maybe 45 minutes to the north. So just wow, I was surfing a typhoon on my first visit there. So it was just an extraordinary place to live. Our kids were born and raised on a beach in Hong Kong. The second thing is just it's access to the rest of Asia. So hop on a plane and fly any direction, 2, 3, 4 hours, and you're in 15 different countries, each of which are incredibly different: the food, the culture, and the opportunity, and the challenges, and then take China on its own. Every province is quite different, and different cuisines, and different people, and again,
Then
different.
help me educate on one thing. I know that China was independent and then kind of was reintegrated into the like Chinese mainland. Help me just educate, because it happened in the last couple of years, but I would not be able to say, was it not 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 25 years ago? So when
Yeah,
did they hand?
the handover from the British to China, which was always part of the structure in the deal that was cut, was in '97. So it was before I arrived, but still, I guess the flavor of lot of British expats there, driving interesting businesses. It probably didn't. The flavor didn't. I don't think change a lot from the late '90s to when I first got there. There was a wave of Hong Kong Chinese that left, Vancouver, Sydney. Some people call it Hongcouver. People left, but then a lot of people came back when it seemed like everything kind of stayed more or less the same. And then it's just been in transition. I would say, a lot of people talk about the geopolitical side, the politics of it, that sort of thing. I'd say the biggest shift, though, for Hong Kong in terms of the day-to-day experience of Hong Kong Chinese is that in the maybe around 2007, 8, 9, 10, the and I'll sort of say it this way because it's true, that when I first moved there, Hong Kong and the local Hong Kong Chinese, there was this real clear sense that, look, we were the ones that got out of China. We built these impressive kind of empires, these property businesses and things, and we're the successful Chinese that got to Hong Kong and have a kind of a broad view on the world. And over the border, you have Chinese, peasant farmers, and there was that sense. Unfortunately, that's just the way it felt. And then suddenly, those peasant farmers, in a few years, started amassing a lot of wealth, and were now buying the expensive properties in Hong Kong and getting the important jobs. And so I think it's more like a socio-economic shift that I think had and has still a more profound impact on the flavor of Hong Kong. Not so much there was the British and here's China. It's more the socio-economic setup, as China relates to Hong Kong. I mentioned, though, there were three sort of real big things about Hong Kong that this, what I was just saying, relates to that third one, which is now the entrepreneurial engine of Hong Kong. And that's one of those things, and I could tie it to sort of my first real job, I guess I would say, in Hong Kong. When I first got there, I was doing oceanography research for the government, things like that. But Hong Kong is a place where that flavor of entrepreneurialism, it's small enough but energetic enough where you can have a half-baked idea and there are three people around you that are ready to support it and give you capital. So it just has this incredible engine of entrepreneurialism. So it's just like the right place to be on the, just day to day living. It was beautiful, access to Asia, and that entrepreneurial legend. That's what Hong Kong is like. And it's definitely going through an evolution now. It's more, because what is Hong Kong's role in the context of, let's say, the geopolitics with China in relation to a lot of countries that had a lot of investment in China. We're building a lot of supply chains in China. And as that sort of shifted, Hong Kong's role of being a gateway to China is, something that is currently being reinvented, I guess you could say, and it'll take some time for Hong Kong. It had gone from a place, I guess, that was very powerful and energetic to one that's, doing a bit of soul searching at the moment, but still with what I would argue is one of the most beautiful places to live. Just
What I love so much, because I mean, I fell in love with Guatemala. I could say the same thing. Not the entrepreneurial engine, but I kind of didn't need to change one iota my business model. It's just closer to the United States and like the biggest
yeah,
emerging markets like Brazil and Mexico. So, what I sense is like your early biography and falling in love with Hong Kong and getting your first job. Question: was the first job already related to, let's say, the playing field, the sandbox that you find yourself in for more than 20 years, like hashtag carbon markets? Or was it adjacent, or was it more a pivot after that into, let's say, institutional money, big bangs, big picture things? So yeah, just
yeah,
curious to find out that
it was.
first piece in your biography.
I mean, it was really just, again, here's an idea. What can we build on the idea? Let's give it a go. Like that's Hong Kong. And in this particular case, it was, when I left New York, I had designed a program for senior citizens for convalescent centers in New York that was bringing science discussion forums to convalescent centers where you have people who have 8, 9 decades of life, but they're in a place where the only conversation is, who's sick or dying, who's not getting visited, that sort of thing. And so go there, bring a topic, and then just hear what people have to say. And so I tried to figure out whether I could do that in Hong Kong. And in doing that, I was introduced to someone who happened to be the chairman of one of the largest commodities groups in the region. I didn't know that, but I was, talking to him about this because he had been doing a lot of work with senior citizens. He was introduced. It's literally as I'm looking for someone like this. You talk to one person, then they know the most powerful person in that space, and that's the way Hong Kong, is kind of set up. So he started asking a lot about the environmental science stuff, oceanography, really talking about, oceanographic currents and how that relates to climate, and just really intrigued. And so he started asking questions that led to the business that he was involved in, which is, look, if we could throw better science at it, could we help mining companies be more efficient? Could we help energy companies be more efficient or have less, environmental negative impact on the world? Just those sort of questions. And when we got to the end of the conversation, he said, "Hey, would you mind coming in and talking with me and this, my partner, the CEO of this company?" I didn't even know the name of the company. And I went in, and, I think I had, which what I was wearing at the time almost religiously was like a rubber shark necklace, and I went in there. I probably had flip-flops on, and went in there just to talk science with someone who sounded interesting and his partner. And we're in this office and we're chatting about it, and they started asking really pointed questions around, well, what would we do to help, a copper mine that's got these issues? How do we analyze what they're doing to avoid pollution, and things like that. And so suddenly, about 30 minutes into the conversation, it became one of, well, is there a way to set up a company that could help these companies? I'm like, yeah, well, yeah,
But isn't that an interesting pivotal moment in a biography? Because it feels like, I mean, I always say karma,
yeah,
accident, or fate are just three different words for something we as human beings will never understand. So
yeah,
basically, I see you now, with your flip flops sitting in that office, multi-billion-dollar conglomerate, and they're asking you basically, how could we help big infrastructure projects have less of an environmental impact? And you come from oceanography, right? Sciences. So how did that translate into an engagement, or did you co-found a company?
It was, I mean, again, like a classic crazy Hong Kong story where, yeah, I was one of the few people who understood these type of environmental issues that they knew, and they had these ideas. Let's do it. And so where it became, we sort of iterated in real time on, well, maybe we can help design studies for them and bring experts in to help them, future proof their businesses. And for them as a trading company, that helps bring more to the table. It helps support their relationships with customers. And we sort of, they then said, well, would you want to do that, in the conversation, and what would it take? And so all of a sudden at that moment, I was like, well, hold on a minute. In my mind, okay, this is the enemy, right? This is like the big company doing metals and minerals and energy and shipping. Like these are the bad guys in my mind. And so as they asked me, I sort of said, well, I was like, okay, the way I'm going to get out of this is I'm going to ask for something like insultingly high, in terms of like what I need to build this business. And then they looked at each other and they left the room, and they came back, a minute later, and they kind of added 50-60% to what I asked for in terms of, the budget to build this company. And they looked at me and said, look, if we're going to do this, you got to be serious. And suddenly I was like, okay, I am, an oceanographer, and I do have to step up to this if I'm going to do it. I learned that the world is much bigger, and the resources needed to really tackle this issue is much bigger than my mind could grasp at the moment. So we decided to set it up, and in the early, first year or so, it was more that kind of trying to bring, and the company was called Noble Environmental Solutions, trying to bring solutions to these companies. But where it really started to click was we found a few opportunities to invest in biofuels. And that's where the amount of support and interest from the board and the way in which we could bring the company's resources and capability to the table, really suddenly it was like, okay, we have to do things that are green and moving the needle on climate change, on environment, improving air quality, but do it in a sort of investment tradable commodity way. So we started doing a lot of biofuel investment, which led to energy efficiency investment. So providing capital to steel companies to capture waste heat and getting a share of savings. And then 2004 is when we set up the carbon business, and it was just, okay, that's where we hit fifth gear. It was like, okay, big framework for cross-border finance. We're in the part of the world where the baseline is so low. There's so much to do: energy efficiency, dealing with waste, dealing with industrial gases. This one actually thing I wanted to kind of overlay to the discussion is that people talk about carbon market and carbon mitigation, but what's important as well to remember is this is greenhouse gases. It's not carbon. It's not CO2. It's greenhouse gases, of which CO2 is one. And so many of the projects that we were involved in were adipic acid and hydrofluorocarbon and SF6 and methane and stuff. So again, broad gamut of greenhouse gases. But yeah, that was kind of the Hong Kong story of going from someone who had, I guess, a certain degree of a view of the world as to where my impact could sort of be pointed, or my capabilities could be pointed, to one where suddenly I was sitting in this place where I had far more resource than I could have ever imagined, but just had to hustle and figure it out. And I was sat across the guy that was running the global coal business. And then on my right side was the guy that was running new business development. And we just came up with the wackiest ideas to do, carbon neutral coal. Let's invest in carbon projects and package that. So there's pre-offset, coal cargoes. And we tried lots of things. Some of it stuck, some of it didn't. But, for the company, we had one of the
And
large.
One question here, because I mean, you're a very funky, multifaceted creature. I think that, clicked from the very first moment. If I remember rightly, so the title was like Head of Origination. Can
Yeah.
you explain for people that are not for decades in finance, what does Head of Origination mean, and sketch two or three example of, let's say, maybe one or two that worked, one or two that did not work, of these, like, you used the terminology like wacky, before it then obviously it became more like framework driven and grounded, in the framework of the bigger Kyoto Protocol.
Yeah. Well, okay. So origination, and kind of financing, but in other markets is finding the opportunities. And so my job was to go out and, we had a business model. Let's invest in these projects. We'll enter into these long-term contracts to provide capital and get offtake in terms of carbon credits and bring that to market. That's our business. Origination now is, where are we going to go? Are we going to go to China or India or Indonesia? Where are the projects? Where's the biggest bang for the buck? Where do we have relationships? And it's figuring those things out, putting a strategy around it, and then going out and identifying counterparties, starting a negotiation, getting the wheels turning on a transaction, and finally involving everything from negotiation to due diligence and execution. And I guess in the early days, what was so cool and is that, what did that mean? That this was Kyoto, when we set the business up, Kyoto hadn't yet started, and 2005 was the first, sort of compliance period. And so we were going into these markets, take China, for example, where largest, range of opportunities for carbon mitigation globally. Um, the China government, the central government, had a role. The way the structure under Kyoto worked is that you had a host country and an investor country that had to both approve projects. That the host country, the China side, but in every other country, it wasn't really set up yet. They were like, "There's this Kyoto thing. I know we're part of it. We're supposed to be approving these projects, but we don't really even know how, like, and what are these projects?" And so what was very interesting and was part of that origination in the beginning was real capacity building, going into these countries to say, hey, we've got capital. We want to invest in your steel, mills, your cement companies, your landfills. And what we want, and it was, helping the government, figure out how to approve projects, but then now engaging with companies where we're sitting there saying, hey, we want to put this equipment in your facility that's going to make you more efficient. We're going to do it with our money, make you more efficient, improve your operations overall. And we're going to buy this thing that doesn't exist, this like anti commodity, this carbon mitigation. And, the looks, as you can imagine, we're getting is, I mean, sounds way too good to be true, sounds like a scam,
Okay, let's stay on that level. Let's stay on that level, because most of the people are dialing in. They're very advanced, but and I studied that, right? But if you explain somebody that sounds like a scam, that you're helping people to offset something in the future, explain that to a layman, and maybe give again, what are one or two examples in this like Wild West early days capacity building, where maybe some of it has been a scam or close to a scam, or it did not work out? And what were successful examples where people finally got, okay, on this side, we're investing to help you reduce your carbon footprint, let's say, to keep an easy example, or other climate gases. And for that, you get rewarded in the future. But not only that, the rewards in the future, they have a certain value that we're still figuring out in the early days, but that will find a price. How do you explain all of that to, I don't know, your mom? I don't know if your mom still lives, but maybe when she was living and she was asking, Bill, what are you doing in Hong Kong? Like, how do you explain all of that complexity to a layman?
Yeah, sure. And I've had these conversations before, and sometimes successfully, sometimes not. But yeah. So there's two sides of the, I guess you could say, the market. So there's the, how do I engage with the projects on the ground and convince them to work with us, where we're going to finance them and pay them for these, for these credits. And then there's the demand side, which is who needs the credits and why. And so kind of to explain that, and I'll explain it maybe through the Kyoto Protocol kind of framework, is that under Kyoto Protocol, which is the precursor to Paris Agreement, you have what were called Annex 1 and non-Annex 1 countries. Annex 1 countries were more the advanced developed markets that set specific carbon reduction targets each year. So, okay, you've got the kind of country level carbon reductions that are set out each year. Under Paris Agreement, it's under what are called NDCs, nationally determined contributions. How much are we going to reduce each year? Under Kyoto, it's your Annex 1 countries setting these annual reduction targets. And then the next layer of that on the demand side is, okay, now that the country has set this target, how does the country implement that? Do we put that on the energy companies? Do we put that on the steel companies? Do we put that on the commercial buildings? How do we achieve those carbon reductions? And that's where the kind of cap part of it, the carbon cap and reduction each year, happens. Now the trade side, and why carbon trading exists, is, okay, if you're now let's say a German utility or a German steel mill, and you've got to reduce by 1 million tons over these next 5 years on an annual basis, you can do that one of two ways. You can either change what your operations look like, so implement energy efficiency, implement renewables, or, and it ends up being the right solution is an and or, or you can invest in projects elsewhere that are doing that. And the credit is simply, a lot of people falsely describe it as, this carbon credit is a pay to pollute. I can buy that so I don't have to reduce. It's exactly the opposite. A carbon credit is a digital / paper trail showing that you did reduce emissions somewhere in the world. That's what a carbon credit is. It's a carbon mitigation. It happened to happen there and not here, and it's just the evidence that it happened. And that's what making a claim on a credit means. So now in that German steel mill, and the right solution is, okay, I can achieve in a cost-effective way, let's say out of that 1 million tons a year, I can achieve this year 100,000 tons locally, and then I can invest in this project in India, where I can get maybe 7 times the amount of mitigation for the same amount of capital. So invest in that project. It requires that engagement. That's the cap and trade part. So now I need to invest in that project, get it approved by the United Nations and the host country, and finally each year get that evidence of emission reduction, that carbon credit out of that project. Now this year I achieved my 1 million tons, 100,000 locally, 800,000 or 900,000 in a project overseas. Next year I'll implement more efficiency at my steel mill, get it down to maybe 300 tons reduction, and then invest in other projects. And so you have this iterative process where the goal is domestically to achieve what you can on a reasonable timeline in a cost-effective way, and then achieve the rest of the target and the obligation by investing in projects overseas. And it works very well because in lesser developed nations, where you have assets that have inherently, let's say, are dirtier or less efficient, you get a lot more bang for the buck by implementing energy efficiency or implementing waste management in a lesser developed nation than you do, say, in Europe. Like, you can spend a lot of money and get little carbon mitigation when you're already that far advanced. Much like many systems. When you've already
I mean,
gotten.
I'm very familiar with the system. So before we dive in some boots on the ground, and then what have been your different parts in your biography of what you've built and where you're now invited to, let's stay on the very macro level. So it kind of feels intuitively makes sense, like you said. Steel mill in Germany, you need very high capital intense measures to get the reductions down. And you're actually more efficient with the same amount of capital to, just to make it simple for the listeners, to reduce the emissions in an Indian steel mill, right? and you buy those credits, and then you fulfill your obligation that gets summed up to the national level. Nevertheless, out there are a lot of voices, right, who say some of it is still a little bit scammy. Um, what are some examples, maybe from the earlier days, but I reckon also today, where you have the feeling, I don't, like me, Bill, I don't have the feeling this like really pans out like in the textbook of the macroeconomists and
Yeah.
on the, like UN level? Where does it not pan out, and what are some examples to then sketch some of the examples where you think this very successfully works?
Yeah. Well, I guess I'll give maybe a current example, but also a historic example. The current example that I think is getting a lot of headlines is in the natural capital space, and in particular, avoided deforestation. And that's a situation where you say, okay, here's a large landscape that has a probability of getting deforested. Um, and what we're going to do is invest in a set of, a team and a set of contracts that will protect that forest. And that's called, in the carbon market, avoided deforestation. Now, the challenges and where the, let's call it, potent risk of scam comes in, but it's more of a challenge of the complexity of the project, is that you have this large landscape where you have to establish a baseline. Well, what is the probability of that getting deforested? Well, we can look at the trends, and we can look at that over a long series of time. And we can look at what's happening now and forecast that if we don't do anything, here's how much forest we're going to lose. And then we'll invest in protecting that. We'll get the government on board, make sure that they're on board with our legal right to restrict that deforestation. And then the difference between what would have happened in that counterfactual and what we've protected is the amount of carbon credits. So the challenge in that space then is your baseline setting right? Are you doing the right analysis as to where those trends would likely have gotten to? And because it's a bit of an exercise of looking at trends, and it's a counterfactual argument, there is no right answer. And so over time, it's a level of increasing degrees of comfort or discomfort with whether you've gotten it right. And so that there's
I
been
love
quite.
the I love the example. Again, I'm trying to sketch that through a layman's perspective. So, if I get your argument right, you're basically saying, uh, to take this steel mill example in Germany and the steel mill example in India, you can measure a lot. It's industrial processes, right? It's kind of doesn't really economically make sense to put all the capital into reducing the emissions on the German steel mill, and
Yeah.
instead reduce way more emissions on the Indian steel mill, where the
Right.
example of the forest is just way more complex. There's way more difficult boundary conditions. How do you measure that? What's the baseline? What's the de-risking of the project? But just because there are way more factors involved. And I like that, because to stay in this, like, instead of it's good or bad, instead of like they're doing it bad, they're putting carbon credits, out there so that they can pollute, which I think is a dumb example. Let's just say the more complex the measurement, right, the more difficult it is to assess from a de-risking perspective, in the example of the forest.
Correct. And
um
what it means is, is that you, I think, need to go about collaboration in this space with a view that we need to just keep pushing things in the right direction. We're never necessarily going to get precisely the right answer, and but we need, as long as we're moving the needle in the right direction in a very material way and making corrections along the way, is, in my view, the attitude of the market has to have. One of the challenges is there's a little bit of a scared of its own shadow kind of reality in the market, where corporates or governments, as soon as there's a small headline of getting it wrong, yeah, they potentially run the other direction. So, but anyway, sorry, you were gonna say something.
um No, I think, let's continue both the biographical journey as well as deepening the understanding of the listeners. So, okay, it's the Wild West, right? So we're in the early days of Kyoto, the wacky examples, some work, some not. I think for the sake of the conversation, I think these two examples, reducing emissions in steel mills, is kind of easier to calculate, right, than complex whole landscape ecosystems with the example of forests. I'm curious on the intersection of the first job and as head of origination, what was the origination of Al Infra, which took a very long time to get off the ground, a lot of learnings. And then also, just maybe midway into the conversation, why Web3? Because there's the blockchain Web3 enthusiasts and evangelists, most of which I don't find particularly interesting because all they're doing is arbitrage trading in between different coins. Okay.
Mm.
A lot of people do arbitrage trading, but not so much my turf or interest because I'm all about impact. So obviously, yeah, I'm not too sure where is this point in the career or how that ties into
Yeah.
Al Infra, but yeah, curious on the early days of Web3 and what sparked the interest in getting Al Infra off
Okay.
the ground.
So I think, as I mentioned, we set up that first carbon business in 2004. I joined a financial institution in 2007, ran their carbon and environmental infrastructure business in Asia for 8 years. And in all that time, we're investing in projects in remote places, in emerging markets where the green part of that product, whether it was getting the credit for investing in green infrastructure and getting better debt for that, or getting the carbon product out. We've got hundreds of projects in all these remote places. And in order to get that benefit, carbon credits for revenue or meeting our obligations under the debt, it's a data story. And so in the traditional market and historic market, one of the biggest pain points, and actually one of the biggest reasons that Kyoto was not extended, is that, okay, we can get a project approved, we can get the capital deployed, the project's working, but then the prospect of getting a carbon credit out means I've got to find these approved third parties, get them to go and visit the project in this remote area, spend multiple days on site gathering data from devices on that asset, going back to their offices, crunching the numbers, putting it in spreadsheets, writing reports, and door to door, the time, generally speaking, to go from I've got a year of production, now let's press go, let's have them visit, let's have them write the report, send it to the UN in that case, or to Vera or Gold Standard. Door to door, it would take anywhere from 6 to sometimes 8 months, sometimes even more, just to get one vintage, one period of credits out of that project, and would cost between $30,000 to $80,000 just for that administrative process. So, and now multiply that by 100 plus projects in 12 different countries with potentially liabilities on the other side, meaning if I don't deliver the credits on time, I have to pay a penalty. So, a lot of value on the line, very challenging reality of getting that product out of these projects. And that was one of the reasons that there was a lot of discussion and debate that led to the extension of what was expected in 2012 extended from 2012 onward. It just didn't happen because people said this is just too hard. We were very selective about the projects that we invested in. We had a very high production rate of credits from the assets. We were really good at doing what we did, but it was really challenging for a lot of people, and there was a lot of pushback. So how that kind of connects to sort of Web3 and all infras. Okay, Paris Agreement signed in 2015, and I could see, okay, here comes the next big wave of the carbon markets. And so looking at the structure of that, looking at what was common or different from Kyoto, but one of the important things that was and is still common is the data, getting the access to the data from all these assets, if this market is going to work, is going to be a challenge again. and it's one of the biggest pieces of friction that reduces the amount of capital moving and investing in projects. Is how do you get the benefit of that investment out of the projects? And so with that, for me, it was looking back at 15 years of living through the pain of going back to these projects. Hey, why can't we get this just this simple update of the power production or the on-site power consumption? Well, where is that data? It's in this control room over here. The guy's, he doesn't really know what you're asking for, so it's just like it's gone silent for 6 weeks, and so I was looking at that saying, well, there must be a way that we can get this data online somehow. There must be a way that we can tap into that data. Technology's moved on. I was not I was a more industrial technology guy, but not a sort of software and certainly not a Web3 guy. And not sure there were many Web3 people in 2015 looking at this sort of application, but for me, it was really like, if this is going to work, and it has to work, Paris Agreement has to work. If it's going to work, we have to solve this problem. And it's probably the biggest problem in my experience in the market that has to be solved. And so it was that kind of puzzle of how do we bring solutions to the table that allows you to get that data from all these assets on digital rails. And so that began the thinking. It wasn't all infra yet, but that was the beginning of the thinking of how do we do that? Is there a way to do that? What technologies are out there? And I guess around 2017, 18, I started to kind of bump into Web3 people, people that were active in whether it was just from pure crypto perspective or building tools on blockchain for tokenizing value in different ways. And so I was like, well, maybe that's part of it. And so we started looking at ways in which we could take devices, so smart meters, building management systems, SCADA systems, soil sensors, you name it, the things that you need the data from to get the credit. How can we get those devices recognized in a trusted way in an environment where I now don't need to have these third parties come to the site, or I don't need them every time? They can maybe do more periodic checks to make sure the system's in place, right? And things like that. And so it was that was one side of it, is how do we get these devices registered into some type of technology system where they're recognized. You could see those assets from those devices remotely. And then how do we get the data from those devices, knowing they're the same device over time, and then make that data available to someone, whether it's Vera or the United Nations, make that, or to your lender? How do we make that data available where they can trace it back to a particular project and device at a moment in time, and they can see that carbon mitigation happened, in real time? And so that was sort of we didn't know whether it was possible. It will always be a moving target in terms of what you can bring online and how much I guess redundancy you need in terms of third parties to come and audit what's happening and things. But that was sort of the thinking around the background to all infra. And I guess to kind of conclude that all infra then has a suite of tools for getting data on digital rails. The other part's tokenization. Now, how can we package the value in a tokenized form that's easily transferable? Took us a few years to figure that out, and then it took many more years for the market to understand what we were doing and to stop resisting and embrace. And so as you can imagine, there were a lot of big companies who were well paid in green finance by doing those audits.
I just wanted to say, because the interesting thing is we have a couple of very interesting overlaps in the biography. So my first job after my studies was to build up the first B2B magazine on sustainability issues in Germany, Austria, and Switzerland, so the German-speaking countries. So I'm pretty familiar with the context, especially of the, let's say, you would say Fortune 500. Let's just say big blue chip companies in this whole environment. And I saw all of these audit agencies sprouting up like nothing, because obviously if the assessment is so difficult and it's the Wild West out there and everybody kind of cooks his own standards, so we're pre-gold standard and it's the early days of the market. And now I have a guy, Bill, with a small team out of Hong Kong, basically saying, wait, we're putting the records, the data of all these instruments. Basically, we're building a data backend, right? And some standards and structures. And ideally, that's the promise of blockchain, we're putting that on chain. So we have immutable records of the data, which then by the very definition cuts out either completely or, like you said, the very capital intensive third party audits. Let's stay in this like realm for a moment, because you were mentioning that this took a couple of years and you literally just venturing out of that. um, what were the biggest use cases where you finally saw traction, that your idea, your origination of the idea to getting the measurement of the devices standardized, levelized, readable, machine readable, and on chain? Um, was this another, let's say, lucky moment that you suddenly had a big client and that made all the others follow? Or like how did this like going to market and the resistance from the third party providers, all these big audit companies, how did that, what's the life cycle of the whole thing?
Yeah. Um, well, I'll address that. One thing I'll shine a light on is that there are other reasons that doing that solve challenges in this cross-border green finance market. One of those is that, as you could imagine, some of these assets, whether they're power assets or industrial assets in many countries, are considered, certainly by the companies, commercial secret. This granular data of what's happening at my project is commercially sensitive, and in many cases state secret. Exporting power production and consumption data out of certain countries is illegal, and having that and so you had this historic challenge of, well, in order to get the credits, you need the data ultimately in the United Nations and in this market, but at the same time you need to keep the data onshore. And the way that was solved in the analog way was, most countries could get comfortable with the fact that even though you gathered all of the granular data, what you needed to report publicly was the, let's say, quarterly or annual data. So you report the sum total. You don't have to report the day-to-day volatility in detail, because that's where the sensitive stuff is. Did we have unscheduled maintenance? Was our factory closed? Things like that. And so, Web3 allows you to bring in things like zero knowledge proof. We can gather all the data and then have the outcome reported with a zero knowledge proof, meaning we keep the data onshore, but the result offshore. Really solves, those sort of problems. Likewise, under the Paris Agreement framework, countries have to keep their domestic carbon scorecard. And if you export credits, your scorecard, your accounting in your country changes, and there's something called corresponding adjustments that need to happen. Having that all done digitally basically already does the adjustment, that can go right into the country's reporting rather than having a second step of audit. Now, in to kind of answer your question, it's sort of, I guess, the first leg of the journey for us was, can we do it? Is it possible for us to get connected to devices in a way where we could see that device remotely and collect the data? And I guess one of the, I suppose, hacks that I had was that I was dealing with these project developers for already 15 years, and I provided to them a lot of capital. I brought them into opportunities that really sort of helped their business in a material way, and so there was a lot of trust with some of the biggest players in Asia Pacific. And so for us, when we started designing solutions, it was very easy to call my buddy that I've been working with for years that runs some of the largest renewable companies and say, hey, look, we've got this, again, wacky idea. Can you give us access to your very expensive project? I promise we won't mess it up. and let us see if this works. And so that was very helpful, because we were not, and this is important, we were not a blockchain team or a Web3 team or a software team saying, hey, there's this market, we think we can create a solution, let's build the best creative thing and then try to bring it in there. It was like coming from living in this market, understanding who the players are, understanding those challenges, and very narrowly saying, what can we build that's most effective at solving those problems? And I think that that's, yeah, that's one of the things that kind of gave us a bit of a different footing in the market, is that, whether it was with the UN or country level, we had longstanding relationships, so there was a level of trust. There were lots of Web3 projects out there that were very good-hearted, creative, technically competent, but that didn't understand the way the market worked, the regulations worked, the way the product worked. And so, you know, I think the Web3 for climate space has a very checkered reception in the market for that reason. But for us, I guess, we um, collecting data from commercial buildings, looking at their energy consumption, and looking at then connecting that data from, I'm consuming this much energy, but I'm importing this much renewables, matching that with the energy consumption, and packaging that into here's how much carbon neutral power you're using in this building at this floor. Perfect use case for this kind of thing. We can get those devices and building management systems and smart meters online. Likewise, renewable assets. We're connected to many renewable energy assets in Asia Pacific early on, and we did find that we could get their meters registered on chain in such a way that if they changed the meter or they changed the credentialing, our system would say, look, we're still seeing power production data, but it's an alien device. We shouldn't collect that data. We would get a ping, we'd call them up and say,
What I love about the whole story is, ultimately, let's circle back. What I get is you didn't build tech first. You didn't come from an airy fairy, this is the best solution, let's see how that matches the realities of the market. But you were coming from the realities of the market. And I get from the whole conversation a very, I would say, almost from a values perspective, this, like, instead of trying to build the best solution, trust that incrementally increasing the transparency in the market and the efficiency in the market will reap long-term benefits in the overall conversation of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. I want to jump a little bit because I think we don't want to run over in the podcast, but
extending on this,
Sure.
which is important, is that that what you're suggesting is so true for us, that one of the most challenging negotiations we had with one of our earliest investors, who very much a blockchain platform, was we were adamant about the fact that blockchain was in no way baked into our business plan or in any way an obligation of us. Like, for us, don't care 2 cents about blockchain. This is about creating efficiency in environmental finance and solving climate change. If some other technology came along that did that more effectively, I would switch immediately. Like, we're not a blockchain first platform. It happens to be a great solution for what we're doing for those applications. There's other tech we use, but we're not, and will never be, a blockchain company bringing solutions to market. We're a climate finance solutions company that uses whatever's best at any given time.
Yeah, I strongly resonate with that. Let's jump a little bit timelines, because I still want to cover the current situation, and then jump into the Horizon 1, 2, 3 framework, which I really adore. Is can you sketch later examples at All Infra, and when ultimately the opportunity came to, I would say, jump to the next live phase? Because you spent, I don't know how many years did you spend with Ala Infra? Almost a decade, a full decade. Like I mean,
No, it wasn't that long, 2019. So about, let's say, 4 to 5 years before we made this next step of the journey, which we can describe in a moment. But yes, about 4 to 5 years.
and then let's stay for a short moment with All Infra. What were the signs from, let's say, early adoption to, okay, I think we worked hard for a couple of years and we were like ahead of the bell curve? Very much my personality and most of my business partners. And sometimes you're too early and then you dry out just because you need to find product market fit. When did you see signs of, we think we figured out something that really makes sense and we see adoption at All Infra?
Yeah. So I guess, a couple of years back, and for sure, yes, the first leg of the journey is, can we actually do it and build it and will it work? But then a lot of that, maybe appreciating the benefit of being having the late mover advantage, was we were an early mover. And then just that long, hard uphill battle of showing the incumbents, showing the industry, the ecosystem, look, this is another way to do it, and getting them to give the time to it, but then once they see it, not push back. And that pushback was just profound for a long period of time. And I think one of the places where it really clicked, where we started getting people to look at it differently, was when we did a kind of pilot between a renewable energy asset that was on a particular, I won't mention the standard, but one of the carbon standards where you go through that traditional process for getting your credits out. And side by side, we ran the digital process. And our hope was that we could do it at a lower cost in a shorter amount of time and come up with, let's say, if we came up within plus or minus 5% of the same answer, then the time and the cost savings, we could just haircut, the data if we have to, but that's a much better solution than the opaque, no real-time visibility, the cost and the lag. And so we ran that side by side, and the result was, we did what took the traditional process, in that case 5.5 months, to get to the end answer. It took us roughly 2 minutes, because we were already connected to all of the relevant devices, collecting the data every 2 minutes. So at any given time, it was a matter of just now converting that data through, essentially a suite of formulas that we built digitally to give us the result. So we didn't have to send people, they didn't have to analyze it. It was just already pre-wired. So it reduced the time. And in all the meantime, you have, if you're the investor, the data, so you know how much is likely to come and when. Which from a value perspective, I know if I'm going to be short credits, so I should go buy more. Or I know if I'm going to have too many credits, so I can go sell some options, things like that. A lot of value in that part. The cost side of it, was, I think in that case, around $40,000. In our case, the cost to the client was about 1,800, so a fraction of the cost. And the result was a difference of 0.12%. So we were hoping to be within five.
Amazing. Okay, I totally get the pilot because this usually when you see adoption, right? It makes sense in the market. You save, I mean,
Yeah,
you save copious amounts of time, you save a lot of money, and let's say the result, right, can really compete down to a very minor statistical
and having
insignificant.
that, be
Yeah.
able to show people in conversations, look, here's what's actually happening. They're like,
Yeah.
we, at a minimum, we better take this seriously. In many cases, as you could imagine, it went from companies that were part of the old model saying, hey, well, actually that's going to work, now let us build that ourselves. So now it's like the challenge of not creating our own formidable competitors, and things like that. So I think, that was part of that, the journey. But yeah, that's when it clicked, I think, was just really being able to prove side by side, old model, new model, benefits clear. Now, and this transitions to, kind of why we're taking this next step with a company called Gigatons, is that then set the stage for, now what do we do? Do we raise capital and become kind of put our heads down and go full bore software sales company, building, iterating, and selling software to the market? Or do we use the know-how that we have, the experience we have, and the technology that we have to be in the market in a different way? And that's why we took, and I don't know if you want to go into that now, but that's why we sort of chose that path to sort of bake ourselves into.
Please, I definitely want to go there. Sure.
Okay. So yeah, I think for us, it was about a year ago that we ran into couple of the most incredible entrepreneurs that I've come across, two brothers who built what is now the largest EV charging network in Europe, in a European country. It's a company called GridServe, based in the UK. And they started in solar. And when the solar subsidies dropped away in the UK, and the solar market just stopped, these two brothers were like, no, we're going to keep going, but how? Well, let's build our own demand. What about these electric vehicles? Well, the price point is good, but there are no electric vehicles. Well, why are there no electric vehicles? Because there's no charging. So someone's got to build a charging. We'll do it. And so it was this, took a while for them to kind of get investors behind the if you build it, they will come model. But fast forward to today, and it's a hugely successful sun to wheel, as they call it, solar integrated EV charging network in the UK. And they were at a point where we met them, where they were about to launch a global platform to basically take that know-how, which, in any market, including here in the US, electric vehicle charging is very challenging. People who, if you have a Tesla and you're charging on a Tesla network, it works quite well. If you don't have that equation, then it's a basket case of quality. And so, but they were doing it extremely well with any car. And so a lot of pull from other markets for them to, hey, can you take what you did in the UK and bring it to, Australia, US, UAE? And for them, their business plan, the headline is a climate change solutions company. And they were like, look, we've been doing all this stuff, but we haven't been collecting the data. And it became, they were aware of us, and it became this conversation where they're like, look, we've always wanted to measure the data in a reliable, traceable way so that, it was easily reportable. And then we'd like to tie that data to finance, to carbon markets. And we'd like to tie that data to the customers that are using our network and really like bring this, what we think we're doing, or we know we're doing, but put numbers to it and create this, economy around it. And they're like, do you think we could do that? And we're like, well, let us show you many assets where we've been doing that, for multiple years. And so it's just this really great sort of philosophical, intellectual, and solution match for where they were and they wanted to go. And so the company is called Gigatons. And where that led to was a conversation from, hey, could we supply technology to them, to one of, hey, why don't we get rolled in and get acquired and bake our technology into their software stack. And so for them, the journey's been very much one of nailed it in a country, on the map globally, need to take this show on the road to move the needle on climate change. Shift where smart connected was cloud and IoT to now where smart connected is AI and blockchain. And we are part of that, part of that transition into the new take on smart connected. And yeah, match made in heaven in terms of all aspects of, the point of view, the solution, the fit. And so our technology is currently being integrated into that business. And that lateral move for them as well is solar to EV charging, solar to crypto mining, solar to compute. So it's really taking that software stack where they figured out, how do we make it hum between, verifiable renewables to verifiable end users, and how do we use that in other energy intensive markets? And
we won't share all the beautiful things in this like global sandbox that we can play together. So let's just stay high level. Horizon 1, 2, 3 framework. You're basically about to start the job, right? I think you're inner child will be very happy. That's the terminology that I
Mm,
use, when we're able to integrate the various parts that make us human. And as children, all we love is to play. And as head of origination, it's kind of really a playful way. Sure, you need to originate the deal flow and
yeah.
ultimately get the best bang for the buck. But I mean, it's a great opportunity. What do you sense on the first horizon? Let's say the next 1 or 2 years. What are the biggest challenges, and where do you see the biggest opportunities globally in this specific function?
Mm. Maybe one of the biggest opportunities is focus, because when if you look at whether you're a data center or a country that's implementing its obligations under Paris Agreement, so electric vehicle, whether it's buses, trucks, cars, there's so much happening in every market. There's so much ambition, and it has to happen, and it has to happen right. And this company has so much to offer in that equation in all these markets, and are getting pulled. And so really, like, focusing on where is the place to operate from, which are the clients on the origination side, which are the clients that are most ready, which are the partnerships and networks where we can have the biggest impact, and start there. And then scale from there. I think that, like, that challenge will be, taking what is a massive, zero carbon energy transition for lots of energy intensive industries, and keeping the focus on countries and clients that are, ready to implement. So I think that's probably one of the challenges. On the solution side, I think that it's there's not a lot of challenge there. There's the constant need to be upgrading and updating and creating more efficiency. One of the jobs, one of the solutions is connecting the end customers with the climate impact data, and giving them tokenized rewards for, here's how much positive climate impact you had using the network. Thank you very much. Here's a tokenized reward that you can use for currency. And there are corporates that are now agreeing to take that digital climate reward as currency to pay for product and stuff. So really creating almost like a gamified way to bring, the the general population into this. But yeah, I think keeping focused on a manageable set of real projects that can get executed, and just doing the hard work of implementing that. One of in this market, um, it's easy to get just pulled into really fantastic opportunities with great people all over the world, and just kind of keeping a degree of focus, so the bricks on the ground stuff really happens. Um,
From bricks on the ground in the new job Horizon 2, where do you see the market heading? I mean, you have now for plus 2 decades insider knowledge, networks, hard expertise, boots on the ground. So where do you see the overall market heading? And I know it's a complex question, but I would ask both B2B as well as B2C, because I'm well aware that for the first time, like the big corporates, are really very interested actually to creating um, a deeper relationship with their clients and creating incentive mechanisms
yeah,
to give them tokenized rewards, which is then truly a gamified field. You have your Walmart card, doesn't really matter here in Guatemala. It could be Semaco, which is a big chain where you buy all the stuff for the garden and the house, and really incentivize your customers, to change their behavior. I think that's one side of the coin. Like the B2C play is opening up like massively, and on the B2B side, I think we agree there. I mean, we both reckon, right, with the new administration in the US, there will be more widespread adoption of, let's say, quote unquote, overall blockchain and Web3 technologies
mm.
by mainstream banks, commercial banks, credit cards, and stuff like that. So, yeah, Horizon 2, the next few years, what do you see shaping the market and where you're heading?
Yeah. So I guess the maybe just to comment on the structure of Paris Agreement and the way that sort of impacts opportunities and challenges locally,
Sure.
is that Paris Agreement, you've got 197 odd countries and states set up, signed up to that, and what that means is each jurisdiction that signed up has to set that NDC that I mentioned before, which is okay. We're going to reduce this much greenhouse gas over this period of time to this ultimate goal, and within that, we're going to now implement it on our transport system or on flights coming in and out or ships coming in and out or our domestic industry. And what that means, if you're now a corporate building data centers in multiple markets or shipping product and sourcing product from multiple markets, is you now have both, and I always think of it through this, in this sort of way, carbon assets and opportunities, but also massive carbon liabilities. So if I'm to expand my business, but this country has set or is about to set a cap on how much carbon I can emit, or where that I need the renewable to power my data center, it's become one of the greatest bottlenecks for corporates in terms of being able to expand, being able to be comfortable. They won't run into a lack of financing because now the lenders can't lend to carbon intensive industries, or the countries won't permit carbon intensive assets. So suddenly it's gone from, I think, maybe domestically we have to be seen to be doing the right thing, and let's invest in some cute projects and in markets and talk about it on our annual report, to one where the reality in every single country now is there is an existing or imminent carbon asset and carbon liability problem we have to solve. And so I think that one of the things and one of the ways in which that's moving the market is one from where it's just about investing in projects for carbon credits to one where that carbon benefit, maybe the best benefit for that project is to create a carbon credit and monetize that for revenue. Maybe the best way to use it is to keep the carbon benefit, the carbon mitigation, at that asset level and get cheaper debt. So the lenders will lend to me at better rates if I can prove the emission reductions. If I export that emission reduction, that person I exported to can make the claim. I can't. So it might be better off to keep the carbon mitigation in my project and get better debt. It might be better to keep it because now the local government takes Singapore, 25 Singapore per metric ton carbon tax. If I'm covered under that and I've got, this potential to sell my credit, let's say for $20, or keep it on site and avoid $25 of carbon tax, I better do that. And that's not creating a carbon credit and selling it, that's verifying the carbon mitigation. So the market's really changing. It's always been to some degree like this, but I think the way that it's changing in a significant way and really ties to that persistent need for the data, is that carbon asset or carbon liability needs to be tracked, and decisions around what I do with it need to be made in a very sophisticated way for corporates that have diversified assets in multiple countries. Again, it's become a real bottleneck for many companies that want to build more compute capacity or build export technology for transport systems. Really solving that riddle is critical, and will continue to become more of an acute pain point.
So what I sense is really the rules of the market at large on a global level, obviously very specifically to the, let's say, domestic market, are changing through the frameworks that were put in place and create both the incentive mechanisms as well as, let's say, the cost on capital. Um, um, let's look into a crystal ball. If you're successful with gigatons, I don't know for how long you want to work in your biography, but some years, right? So you're not planning to retire in the next 24 months. Horizon 3. Horizon 3 is kind of always like a crystal ball, but
Yeah.
what would be a positive outlook? You're successful, you have fun, you see global cross-border transactions, more transparency. You see widespread spread adoption, the success case of the brothers at Gigatons. They find new markets. Ultimately, obviously, they're not only focusing on electric vehicles, but really more trying to build a whole ecosystem of how can these best practice examples in the carbon markets be used as a lever for like implementation on both a domestic as well as international level. That's what I get at Gigatons, which is a big vision. It's like a bold vision. I love how it's stated on the website. So what does success look like for you? What does the world look like in, let's say, 5 to 10 years?
Yeah. You know, I guess there's a certain attitude that informs what that might look like for me, and I'll kind of maybe come back to the I don't care about blockchain. What I care about is accelerating, taking friction out of the front finding. It's not about, this is my mission. I'm religious about this, kind of approach to it. It's just I'm focused on the outcome to really get projects financed in the most effective way. I think about that in a similar way to, the climate change challenge, which is, regardless of what your point of view is on where it's coming from, how much humans are driving it, and global average temperatures are indeed going up, and that does cause extreme climate events and things, and that will happen, and that'll continue to kind of move in a direction, and we'll be fighting that challenge for some time. What In the same way that I'm not kind of a blockchain first person, I also think about that challenge very laterally, which is like, in a similar way, I guess, when Elon Musk comes out, in supporting this current administration, saying, look, I don't want subsidies. I want my business and other businesses that are doing environmentally progressive things to win because we're doing cool stuff that works better, that has a better result. Like, that's why it should be adopted, not because there's some rules that say it has to happen, but because it's a better thing to do. I think about, in my experience, looking at the way in which green projects not just deal with climate change, but reduce respiratory illness, reduce smog in places, like doing things that benefit the climate is just fundamentally, if you look across assets, a better way to do development. And so for me, when I think about where do I want to go, where do I want to be kind of aiming, I guess, my my history of knowledge, and where do I want to apply that, is also along, I guess, sort of a thesis where I can't be specifically focused on CO2 mitigation. Certainly greenhouse gases are multifaceted, and the ways to deal with climate change will become multifaceted, new science, new evidence coming in all the time. So just being open to all that and being just purely focused on making the world a better, cleaner, better to live in place is sort of the North Star, I guess, for me. And so with all that, where does that go? I mean, there's a little bit of a full circle aspect, for me, which is, the ocean. I started as an oceanographer, and I kind of got into more of an industrial environmental setting, but the ocean as part of the climate solution has always been a significant, it's the biggest store of carbon, has the biggest carbon, sequestration potential. It's a challenging environment, but one where there are really interesting solutions that that are coming out to work with the ocean as part of that solution. So I think I'm starting to get involved in a few projects that bring me back to that, back to the ocean, I suppose. But yeah, I think for me, just always kind of following my curiosity and what science is telling me, and not kind of being someone who's annoying and preachy to people that, hey, you must do this, but rather like, let's do this because it's great, kind of attitude about things. I'm not sure exactly where that takes me, but that'll be sort of the attitude that I carry when, in whatever 10 years from now looks like.
Yeah, I want to close the podcast from my side with a reflection. So I think the deepest download or the deepest aha moment came very early on when you're with your flip flops in that meeting in Hong Kong, and you think you're the good guy, you know, like you're
Mm,
feeling morally superior to those running the coal mines and the oil wells and the copper mines. What I really appreciate about you is just staying committed to making a difference without taking sides to they're morally superior because of a
mm,
certain set of values and they're not. I very much believe that the greatest transition of humanity, where we're right in the middle, right, and I consider both of us more of a transition generation because we're like closer in age than, let's say, I am to your children. Is I think it really has to do with not taking sides, but really
mm.
believing in the genius of human beings that ultimately, yes, we created a humongous amount of global challenges, but we have the genius and the love and the care and the passion and the fun and the curiosity in our different domains to really try to, yeah, tip the needle towards a brighter, greener, more just future. In my language, we're on the cusp of designing the frameworks, the processes, the procedures, the governance structure, the culture, the values towards a planetary civilization.
Yeah.
So, Bill, I love the conversation. I hope the listeners could also take some fun, beautiful, juicy, falling in love with Hong Kong, but also deeper understanding the carbon markets away. And just handing over to you, maybe for some closing words, and then I think we're good for today.
Yeah, well, maybe I'll close with this, which is, in the same way as you just nicely summarized that moment where I'm sitting in this room, young, potentially naive on many things, potentially taking the wrong attitude about these are the bad guys and I know what's right. Um, Expanding that out to an important and big picture, I would say the geopolitics, this as a climate finance has to be cross border. It has to be collaboration if it's to work and if it's to be efficient and drive, low cost of capital to the right projects. And layering that onto like current geopolitics and looking at the way in which the US, like me sitting as the young, potentially good intentioned party, US and China geopolitics, right? China is a place where I've done hundreds of projects with government, with state owned and private enterprise. And it's one of the most joyful experiences I've had in my life. Some of my closest friends and some of my most trusted business partners have been over that journey, in China. And in a similar way, you know, the US has almost this suffix for China, China, our enemy, China, the bad guy. But here's the US, 300 years startup. China's been doing the country thing for 4,000 years plus, right? And if you look at, yes, every country has things they're doing wrong and every country has things to criticize about. We have an exceptionally high prison population, and you can talk all day about our relationship on a geopolitical level with other countries. So I guess one of the things that's really like important in my mind, and I guess a message I'd like to just seed anywhere I can, is look, whether it's China or other countries, it's not, we're superior, we know what we're doing, and we have to run around teaching everyone to do things the way we do as the US. I'm a US citizen, but one where it has to be collaborative and we have to work together. And if we do that, it's going to be a lot of fun. It's going to be less friction. It's going to, certainly, having up, elevated friction with China is in the short term much more traumatic than, kind of the imminent, climate change in the near term. And so I guess I would just sort of say, look, as the US and in this sort of important moment in time, and even with that attitude of people like Elon of like, look, it's not necessarily just about climate change. It's about doing things because they're better and more effective. And then the US, like, yes, we've got a lot to bring to the table. Let's try to be the version of ourselves that we imagine we are, rather than the version of ourselves that we're ends up manifesting in our relationships with other countries. Let's learn from other countries. Let's appreciate that there's a maturity out there that we have to kind of you know really collaborate with and learn from, and and not we're not necessarily right about our point of view, and we're not necessarily superior on the solutions that we think we have. So let's work with other countries in a very collaborative way to do cool stuff and be in a better world. So yeah, maybe I'll leave with that.
Yeah. Thanks, Bill. This was a
Appreciate
beautiful,
it.
and
Thanks.
thanks for the conversation.
Sure.